It was 1971, and a man was sitting on the back porch of his house in Los Angeles at 2 in the morning, looking at the sky. Not because the sky was beautiful, because the sky was wrong. He had grown up in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s and 1950s, and the sky over the city in those years had been a particular shade of dark. The deep, uncompromised darkness of a sky before the age of light pollution had fully arrived. Before the glow of 10,000 streetlights and signs and windows had pushed the stars further back. He remembered that sky. He had it stored in him the way certain sensory memories are stored. Not in the mind exactly, but in the body, in the specific calibration of the eyes that remembered what genuine darkness looked like. The sky over Los Angeles in 1971 was not that sky. It was orange at the edges from the city's glow. It was hazy in a way that was not clouds, a brownish, suspended particulate that the newspapers were starting to call smog, and that the residents of the city had already learned to live with the way you learn to live with a persistent, low-grade pain. By adjusting your expectations of what normal felt like. He sat with his notebook. He had been working on the What's Going On album for months. Had been filling notebooks with the observations and the questions and the fragments of melody that were slowly assembling themselves into the most important record of his life. He had pages about Vietnam, pages about police violence, pages about his brother Frankie and the men who had come back from the war, carrying something they could not name. He had pages about fathers and sons, and the grief of a generation that had believed in things that had then been taken from them. But that night, looking at the wrong sky, he started writing something different. Not about the war, not about racism, not about the specific, human-scale failures of justice and power that the rest of the album was addressing. Something larger. Something that had been nagging at him for months, since he had started paying a different kind of attention to the world outside his window. Not just the social world, the political world, the world of protest marches and assassinations and burning cities, but the physical world, the air, the water, the land, the specific, irreversible ways in which the world he had been born into was being changed by forces that nobody in power seemed to think required urgent attention. He wrote quickly. The words came the way the best words always come, not constructed but received. As if they had been waiting for the right moment to be written down, and the moment had arrived. He wrote about the air turning poisoned, about the mercury in the fish, about the skies becoming something other than what skies were supposed to be, about a planet being consumed by the appetite of a civilization that had never been asked to consider the cost of its consumption. He called it Mercy, Mercy Me, the Ecology. He finished it before dawn. He looked at what he had written and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has said something true, followed immediately by the specific unease of a person who has said something true that the world does not yet want to hear. He brought it to the What's Going On sessions. The musicians heard it and understood immediately that it was different from the other songs on the album. The other songs were about human failures, failures of policy, of justice, of compassion between people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Mercy, Mercy Me was about something else. It was about the relationship between human beings and the physical world they inhabited. A relationship that had been, for the entirety of human history, the foundational relationship, the one from which all other relationships derived, and that was now, in 1971, he visibly deteriorating in ways that the people with the power to address it seemed willing to accept as the inevitable cost of progress. Marvin did not use the word ecology casually. He had been reading. He had been paying attention to the scientists who were beginning to publish research that, in the years to come, would become the foundation of the modern environmental movement. Research about pollution, about pesticides and their effects on food chains, about the accumulation of industrial waste in waterways and soil, and the bodies of the animals and people downstream from them. He had been reading Rachel Carson, whose Silent Spring had been published a decade earlier and had introduced the concept of ecological damage to a general readership that had not previously had language for what was happening to the natural world. He had read it and felt it in the way he felt everything. Not as information to be catalogued, but as a transmission to be absorbed. Something that landed in him and changed the calibration of his attention from that point forward. He started noticing things he had not noticed before. The quality of the air on different days. The color of the water in the rivers near the city. The absence of certain birds and insects that he remembered from his childhood in Washington and that had simply disappeared without anyone declaring their disappearance worthy of public attention. What he noticed, over the months of observation that preceded the writing of Mercy, Mercy Me, was that the world was being consumed. Not in the dramatic, Hollywood sense of a single catastrophic event that announces itself unmistakably and demands a response. In the quieter, more insidious sense of 1,000 small degradations accumulating so gradually that each individual step seemed manageable, seemed within the range of normal variation, seemed like something that could be addressed eventually without the need for the kind of urgent collective action that would actually be required to stop it. He wrote the song in one night. He said it was a warning. The warning was not received. Not because the people who heard it were stupid or indifferent or malicious. Mercy, Mercy Me was heard by millions of people when What's Going On was released in May 1971. It was praised by critics who recognized in it the same quality of social observation that characterized the rest of the album. The ability to see clearly, to name precisely, to translate the complex reality of a moment into music that made the reality emotionally legible. It was cited as evidence of Marvin Gaye's extraordinary range as an artist, his willingness to address subjects that most popular musicians avoided entirely. And then it was filed, categorized, placed in the mental folder marked important, but not urgent, and retrieved occasionally as an example of Marvin Gaye's relevance and seriousness and commitment to speaking truth to power. The power did not change its behavior. The air did not get cleaner. Not immediately, not in the ways that the song had hoped for. Not in the ways that would have constituted a genuine response to the warning it contained. The rivers continued to receive the industrial waste that the factories upstream continued to produce. The fish continued to accumulate the mercury that the factories had been depositing in the waterways for decades. The skies continued to grow orange at the edges from the city's glow. He continued to develop the brownish haze that settled over American cities with a permanence that the medical establishment was only beginning to understand had consequences for the lungs and the cardiovascular systems of the people who breathed it. This is the part of the story that requires the longest view to fully appreciate. The part that cannot be told in the immediate aftermath of the album's release, cannot be told in the decade that followed, cannot even be told in the 2 decades after that. The part that requires 50 years of perspective to see clearly. 50 years after Marvin Gaye wrote Mercy, Mercy Me in one night on the back porch of his house in Los Angeles, looking at the wrong sky, the things he described in that song are not historical curiosities. They are present tense realities. The mercury in the fish, the poisoned air, the oil spills and the plastic in the oceans, and the species disappearing at a rate that scientists compare to the mass extinction events that punctuate the geological record. The specific accumulation of industrial gases in the atmosphere that is changing the temperature of the planet in ways that the most advanced computer models of 1971 could not have calculated, but that Marvin Gaye, sitting on a back porch with a notebook and paying a different kind of attention, somehow felt. He was not a scientist. He did not have access to the data that would later confirm, with the precision of measurement and the authority of peer review, that what he was describing was not metaphor but mechanism. He had a sensitivity. The same sensitivity that made his music the way it was, that made him capable of registering emotional realities before they had been articulated and translating them into sounds that other people recognized as true. Directed toward the physical world rather than the human one. And what that sensitivity registered in 1971 was a warning. The warning contained in Mercy Mercy Me is not primarily about policy. It is not a manifesto or a platform or a list of specific legislative changes that Marvin Gaye believed would address the problem. It is something more fundamental than that. It is an expression of grief. Of the specific, wordless grief of a person who loves the world, who has always loved it, who has found in the physical world the same beauty and the same sustaining presence that other people find in faith or in human relationships, and who is watching that world be damaged in ways that feel, to someone paying attention, not just wrong but irreversible. Mercy Mercy Me. Things ain't what they used to be. The simplicity of that line is deceptive. It sounds like nostalgia, the lament of someone who remembers better days and mourns their passing. But Marvin was not being nostalgic. He was being precise. Things were not what they used to be in a specific, measurable, consequential sense. The air had more particulate matter in it. The water had more industrial waste in it. The fish had more mercury in them. The birds were fewer in number, because the pesticides that increased agricultural yield also thinned the shells of the eggs they laid. Things were not what they used to be, and nobody in power was treating this as the emergency it was. What Marvin understood in 1971, that the political establishment did not want to understand, was that the environmental crisis and the social crisis were not separate problems, with separate causes requiring separate solutions. They were the same problem, the same willingness to prioritize short-term profit over long-term consequences, the same unwillingness to extend moral consideration to people and things that could not advocate powerfully for themselves. The same system that produced police violence against black communities produced the contamination of the rivers that ran through those communities, and the air that their children breathed, and the soil in which their food was grown. He put all of this into 3 minutes and 16 seconds of music. He did it with a voice that had been stripped of its full power by the surgery he was about to undergo. A voice that was already showing the strain of years of singing at maximum intensity. A voice that was delivering its warning with the specific quality of someone who knows they are speaking to an audience that is not yet ready to hear what they are saying. The song does not resolve. It does not offer a solution, a plan, a reason for optimism. It ends on a note of unresolved grief that is, in retrospect, one of the most honest endings in the history of popular music. Marvin Gaye knew, when he wrote Mercy Mercy Me, that he was describing something that was going to get worse before it got better, if it got better at all. He knew because he had been paying attention. And what you see when you pay attention to the physical world in the way he was paying attention to, it is not a story that is moving toward resolution. It is a story that is accelerating toward consequences. 50 years later, the consequences are visible to everyone. The coral reefs bleaching and dying as the ocean temperature rises past the range that the organisms they shelter can survive. The Arctic ice sheet retreating at a pace that satellite imagery documents with a precision that removes any remaining possibility of plausible deniability. The wildfires in California and Australia and Siberia, and Greece burning at scales that the fire management agencies of those countries had not planned for, because the models they were using had not anticipated the pace of change that was actually occurring. The floods and the droughts and the superstorms, each one statistically anomalous when considered in isolation, each one making more sense when considered as part of the pattern that Marvin Gaye described in 1971, and that 50 years of collective inaction have allowed to become a crisis rather than a warning. He said it was a warning. He was right. But here is the thing about warnings that are not heeded. They do not disappear. They do not lose their relevance or their urgency simply because the people who heard them chose not to respond. They accumulate. Alongside the consequences of the inaction they were trying to prevent. And eventually the warning and the consequence become inseparable. The proof that the warning was right embedded in the very damage the warning was trying to prevent. Mercy Mercy Me is more relevant in 2024 than it was in 1971. This is not a tribute to Marvin Gaye's prescience, though it is that. It is an indictment of the 50 years between the writing of the warning and the present moment in which the warning has been confirmed by everything that has happened since. Marvin Gaye died in 1984. He did not live to see the full extent of what he was describing. He did not live to see the scientific consensus that would eventually form around climate change. Did not live to see the data that would confirm the accelerating deterioration of the ecosystems he was warning about. Did not live to see the specific, catastrophic ways in which the things he described in 3 minutes and 16 seconds in 1971 would manifest over the following half-century. But he felt it, in 1971 on a back porch in Los Angeles, looking at a sky that was the wrong color. He felt the direction things were moving, and he wrote it down, and he put it on the most important album of his career, and he sent it out into the world. The world heard it. The world praised it. The world filed it under important, but not urgent, and moved on to the next thing. And the sky kept getting the wrong color. There is something worth sitting within the specific nature of Marvin Gaye's warning. Not just its content, the ecological damage, the poisoned air and water, the disappearing species, but its form. He chose to put this warning in a piece of music. Not in an essay, not in a public statement, not in a political endorsement or a protest march or any of the other forms that social criticism takes when it wants to be taken seriously as policy advocacy. He put it in a song. A beautiful song. A song that sounds like grief rather than anger, that moves through the ear and into the body before it reaches the mind, that bypasses the defensive mechanisms that political speech triggers and arrives somewhere more unprotected. This was not naive. It was strategic in the deepest sense. The strategy of an artist who understood that the most durable form of truth is the one that people carry in their bodies rather than their heads, the one they hum without thinking, the one that comes back to them in quiet moments when the defenses are down and the thing being said has the space to actually land. 50 years later, people are still humming Mercy Mercy Me, still carrying it in their bodies, still returning to it in quiet moments and finding, each time, that it is more true than the last time they heard it, that the world outside the window has moved further in the direction it was moving in 1971, when Marvin Gaye sat on his back porch and wrote the warning down. He said it was a warning. Nobody listened, and 50 years later, everything he warned about came true. The mercy he was asking for, not from any specific human authority, but from the world itself, from the forces of consequence and accumulation and the terrible mathematics of damage that continues to compound long after the people who caused it have moved on to other concerns. That mercy has not yet arrived, but the song remains, the warning remains. The voice of a man who paid attention to the wrong color of the sky in 1971 and understood what it meant remains. And every year, as the consequences accumulate and the warnings become harder to dismiss, more people are going back to that song and hearing, in its 3 minutes and 16 seconds, not a piece of history but a present, tense description of the world they are living in. Marvin Gaye wrote a warning. He was right. The question the warning leaves us with, the question that 3 minutes and 16 seconds of music cannot answer, but can make impossible to avoid, is whether we are willing now to hear it. If this story moved you, if you felt something hearing about a man who saw what was coming 50 years ago and found the only language equal to what he saw, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth does not expire just because nobody acted on it. Leave a comment telling us, what does Marvin Gaye's music mean to you? Ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the legends who changed music forever. We will see you in the next one.